Not long ago, early in this war, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut walked out of a classified briefing at the White House. Now, you have to understand who this man is. He is one of the Gang of Eight. These are the 8 members of Congress, just 8 people in the entire United States government outside the executive branch who are legally entitled to know everything, every secret, every classified operation, every decision the president makes in wartime. He went into that room, he sat down, he listened, and then he walked out and said this. He said, "I emerged from this briefing as dissatisfied and angry, frankly, as I have from any past briefing in my 15 years in the Senate." 15 years. Okay, this man has seen wars. He has been briefed on drone strikes, on covert operations, on budget overruns that would make your head spin, and he said this was the worst. He said, quote, "I am left with more questions than answers, especially about the cost of the war." And then, and this is the part I wouldn't want you to pay attention to, he said he is most concerned about the threat to American lives of potentially deploying our troops on the ground in Iran. Okay, so let's stop here. What does this tell us? This tells us that as of right now, today, the most powerful country in the history of the world, a country with 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, a country that spends more on its military than the next 10 nations combined, a country that can launch a precision strike from 17,000 FT in the air and hit a target the size of a car. That country sent one of its most senior lawmakers into a briefing room, and he came out angry, confused, and scared. Now, the question I want to answer today is simple. Why is this happening? Why is America losing this war? And more importantly, why can it not get out? And I'm going to tell you something right now. The answer has almost nothing to do with missiles. It is almost nothing to do with aircraft carriers or radar systems or any of the weapons we keep talking about on the news. The real answer is something much deeper. And if you understand it, really understand it, you will understand not just this war, but how the next 50 years of history are going to play out. Okay, let's start. Let me ask you a question. When the United States and Israel began military operations against Iran on February 28, 2026, what did Washington expect? They expected, and I want you to really hear this, they expected it would be over in days, maybe weeks. They looked at the map, they looked at the numbers, they looked at their F-22s, their F-35s, their Tomahawk cruise missiles, their HIMARS systems, their satellite-guided precision munitions, and they said Iran's military is nothing compared to ours. We will destroy their air defenses. We will destroy their command and control. We will destroy their nuclear facilities. And then because population is exhausted and the economy is already collapsing from sanctions, the regime will fall or negotiate on our terms. That was the plan. Okay, that was the plan. And on paper, you understand on paper, the logic seemed reasonable because look at what Iran was dealing with. Years of crippling sanctions, an economy where the currency had lost something like 90% of its value over a decade, a population that had been protesting in the streets in a military that had no fifth-generation aircraft, no aircraft carriers, no global strike capability. So from Washington's perspective, this looked like a very manageable problem. Now, I want to give you the first number that should have told everyone this was wrong. And this number is so important, I'm going to write it on the board. The United States right now producing approximately 6 interceptor missiles per month. 6. Okay, 6. And Iran, during the weeks before the ceasefire, was launching somewhere between 50 and 150 drones and ballistic missiles per day. Per day. Do you understand the math here? 6 missiles produced per month. 50 to 150 incoming projectiles per day. This is not a war. This is an accounting problem, and accounting does not work in America's favor. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that nobody in Washington was prepared for. It was not just the volume of Iranian firepower. It was the structure of how Iran fights. And this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, I want to explain something to you called the mosaic defense. And once you understand this, You will understand why the ceasefire that Trump announced means almost nothing. You will understand why the negotiations in Pakistan and Oman and Moscow are probably going nowhere. And you will understand why Senator Blumenthal walked out of that briefing angry. Imagine Iran not as a country with a military. Imagine it as 31 separate organisms, 31 provinces. Each province is its own cell, its own unit. Each one has its own weapons, its own commanders, its own mission. They do not need orders from Tehran to fight. They do not need the Ayatollah to tell them to fire. If every single person in the Iranian leadership, every general, every minister, every cleric were removed tomorrow, those 31 cells would keep fighting. This is called a dead man's switch. If you take out the person holding the switch, the bomb goes off anyway. Now think about what this means for negotiations. Trump announces a ceasefire. Iran's political leadership says, okay, we will review this proposal. But the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the people actually doing the fighting, they are in the provinces. They are in those 31 cells. And they do not trust the Americans. They do not trust the Israelis. And they have no institutional mechanism to simply stop because there is no centralized command telling them what to do. So think about this very carefully. Even if Iran's president wanted to implement a ceasefire, even if he signed every piece of paper, shook every hand, made every phone call, he would then have to go to the IRGC and say, stop. And the IRGC would say, how do we know the Americans won't attack again during the pause? Because and this is a real fact that you need to know, the United States attacked Iran twice during previous diplomatic negotiations, twice while talks were happening. Iran remembers this. Iran's military remembers this. So, implementing a ceasefire for Iran is not just politically difficult. It is structurally impossible without triggering something close to a civil war within its own military apparatus. Because you are asking 31 independent cells, all of which operate under a deeply entrenched ideological framework, all of which have been told that standing down is a strategic betrayal. You are asking them to stop fighting and trust the people who bomb them. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I want to go deeper because we can talk about military strategy all day. We can count missiles and drones and aircraft carriers. But if you only look at the military dimension, you will miss the most important thing. And the most important thing is this. Both sides in this war are operating from a deeply embedded historical narrative, a script that tells them exactly who they are, what they must do, and why they cannot stop. I have talked about this before, what I call the law of narrative convergence. Let me explain it again because it is a key to everything. Every major civilization runs on a narrative. A narrative is not just a story, it is an operating system. It tells a society what its identity is, what threats it faces, what victory looks like, and most importantly, what actions are non-negotiable. And what makes a narrative powerful, almost impossibly powerful, is that it is self-reinforcing. Every attack confirms the narrative. Every setback deepens the commitment. Every sacrifice makes retreat feel like betrayal of everything that came before. Now, the reason this war is so difficult to end is that the narratives of the major players all converge on the same geography, on the same set of historical grievances, and they all require conflict to validate the outcome their narrative has already promised. On one side, you have a narrative of historical restoration, the idea that a specific territory and a specific political order must be reclaimed and secured permanently. This is not negotiable because it is not framed as a policy preference. It is framed as a historical obligation. And if you look at how certain factions in Washington have talked about this conflict, not as a strategic calculation, but as a continuation of a historical arc stretching back decades, you start to see that this narrative framework has penetrated the highest levels of American decision-making. On the Iranian side, you have a different narrative, but it is equally powerful. It is the narrative of resistance. The idea that Iran's identity is defined by its refusal to submit to outside domination. This is not just political positioning. It is a deeply internalized national script that was written through decades of foreign interference, sanctions, and military pressure. And history has already given Iran one proof that this script works. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and I want you to think about this very carefully, Iran had no air force, no tanks, no professional army. Iraq had Soviet weapons, American weapons, and external backing from multiple powers. And Iran sent volunteers, young men with almost no military training, running straight at armored divisions with nothing but rifles. And they stopped the Iraqi advance. Not because they had better weapons, because they had a narrative so powerful it overrode the instinct for self-preservation. And here's what game theory tells us about narrative. When one side is playing for finite stakes, money, territory, political survival, and the other side is playing for identity stakes, who they are, what their history means, whether their sacrifices were worth anything, the side playing for identity stakes will always be willing to absorb more punishment. Always. This is why the Iranian foreign minister, when asked if Iran was afraid of American ground troops, said, "No, we are waiting for them." The journalist was shocked into silence. He had to ask again, "Wait, you are saying you're ready?" And the minister said, "Yes, we are ready for this. This is not bravado. This is what it looks like when a side is operating from a narrative that has already decided the outcome. You do not negotiate with a script. You have to change the story entirely. And nobody in Washington knows how to do that. Okay. Now I want to go back to the numbers because narrative is powerful, but it does not pay for fertilizer. And this brings me to a second dimension of why America is losing this war. Think about what this war is costing. Every time Iran fires a drone, a Shahad drone, which costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000, the United States has to respond. And how do you respond to a drone? With a Patriot interceptor missile that costs about $4 million, or with a naval defense system that costs even more per shot. So, the ratio is something like this. Iran spends $20,000. America spends $4 million. Iran does this 100 times a day. You do the arithmetic. But here's where it gets worse. Because it is not just the cost of the missiles themselves, it is the productive capacity behind them. The United States military-industrial complex is extraordinarily powerful, but it is also extraordinarily slow and expensive. America is currently producing 6 interceptor missiles per month, not 606. Meanwhile, what is Iran producing? Iran under sanctions with a damaged economy using domestically manufactured components. Iran is producing ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at a rate that outpaces American interception capacity by a factor of somewhere between 10 and 20 to 1, depending on the week. And this is why Blumenthal came out angry, because someone in that briefing room showed him the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet said, at current rates of consumption versus production, this war is mathematically unsustainable for the United States. Not in 20 years, not in 5 years, in the near term. Now add to this the economic dimension. The Strait of Hormuz before this war handled approximately 20% of the world's daily oil and liquefied natural gas supplies, 125 to 140 ships per day. Right now, 7 ships in the last 24 hours. 7. Think about what that means. 20,000 sailors are stranded inside the Persian Gulf. Circuit board prices have gone up 40% in a single month because Iran struck the SEI petrochemical complex in Saudi Arabia, which produces 70% of the world's supply of a critical material used to make printed circuit boards. Your phone, your laptop, your car. Every electronic device you own depends on a supply chain that now runs through a war zone that Iran controls. Germany, one of America's most important European allies, has already cut its economic growth forecast in half. Their chancellor went on television and said quite openly that America has no exit strategy in this war. He said to Americans clearly went into this war without any strategy at all. Let that sit for a moment. America's ally, Germany, is publicly saying America has no exit strategy. I've been talking about the Mecca and Tan side of the story, but I want to spend a few minutes on something that most people are not discussing, and that is China's role in this war. Because here's the thing, China is not fighting in this war. China has no soldiers in Iran. China has not fired a single missile. And yet, China may be the party that is benefiting the most from what is happening. Think about what China has done. First, Before the war started, China stockpiled approximately 1.44 billion barrels of oil, 1.4 billion, which means that when the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil prices spiked, China did not suffer. China was fine. While the Philippines, which imports 98% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, was forced to go back to Beijing and asked to restart joint oil exploration talks in the South China. You see what happened there? The war in the Middle East gave China leverage over the Philippines, without China firing a single shot. Second, China has been providing Iran with something that money cannot easily buy on the open market. China has given Iran access to its Yogan and Julin-1 satellite constellations. These are military-grade reconnaissance satellites with synthetic aperture radar. This means Iran can see American aircraft carriers. It can see American air bases. It can track the movements of American forces in real time using Chinese satellites, and then it can feed those coordinates into its BEU navigation system, China's version of GPS, which guides Iranian missiles to within a few meters of their targets. So when you hear about Iranian strikes being surprisingly accurate, when you hear about Iranian missiles hitting targets that the Americans believed were secret, this is why China built the eyes. Iran pulled the trigger. Third, and this is something I want you to think about very carefully, China's long-term strategic goal is Taiwan. And I want to tell you something that happened this morning, today, April 28th. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported that 2 Chinese warships entered the waters southwest of the Pong Islands, a Luong 2 destroyer and a John Kai 2 frigate. And that is not all. Taiwan also tracked 9 Chinese naval vessels and 22 separate military aircraft operating around the island today alone. Today, while we are sitting in this room, the Penanggu Islands are Taiwan's most strategically vital forward bases, sitting at the center of the Taiwan Strait. And China is doing what its military doctrine calls gray zone operations, not attacking, just being there every single day, normalizing their presence, exhausting Taiwan's response capacity, making it feel like the new normal until one day it is. And Taiwan, meanwhile, is trying to pass a special defense budget of 1.25 trillion new Taiwan dollars. And the Americans are telling Taiwan, hurry up and pass that budget because HIMARS systems and Patriot batteries are in extremely high demand globally right now. And if you wait, you will lose your place in the queue because all of America's military production is going to the Middle East. Do you see what is happening? China does not need to fire a single missile at Taiwan. America is doing China's work for it. By fighting Iran, America is depleting its own stocks of precision weapons, exhausting its own logistics, tying down its carrier groups in the Persian Gulf, and leaving Taiwan increasingly exposed. This is not an accident, and it is not a coincidence. Okay, so now we come to the most important question. If this war is going badly, if the map does not work, if the allies are panicking, if China is benefiting, why can America not simply stop? And this is where I want to be very honest with you because the answer is uncomfortable. The first reason is political. The War Powers Resolution, a law passed in 1973, requires the president to obtain congressional authorization within 60 days of beginning military operations. That deadline is May 1st. 3 days from now, the Senate has already voted 5 times to invoke this resolution. 5 times. And 5 times the Republicans have blocked it. 52-47. Then 46-51. And now, as of this week, the Democrats are forcing a 6th vote. A 6th because they know the clock is running out. But here is the reality. The Republicans keep blocking it. Why? Because in American politics right now, telling your base that you voted to stop a war looks like weakness. Even if the war is a disaster. Even if the math does not work. Even if your own allies are publicly saying you have no exit strategy. But here is the deeper reason, and this brings us back to narrative in Washington right now. There are factions that have framed this war not as a strategic calculation, not as a question of cost and benefit, but as the fulfillment of a long-term historical agenda. Netanyahu has spoken publicly about reading history as a guide for the present. Certain senior American officials have spoken about this region in terms of historical milestones that must be completed. And when you frame a war as the completion of a historical mission rather than a policy decision, the calculus changes entirely. You do not ask whether the cost is worth it. You ask whether history will judge you for stopping. What this means in practice is that certain actors in this conflict are not interested in a negotiated outcome that preserves the current territorial and political status quo. They want a different outcome, a more permanent outcome. And that is why every ceasefire announced in this war has fallen apart within hours. Because immediately after the ceasefire announcement, Israel launched over 100 strikes in 10 minutes across Lebanon, resulting in at least 250 casualties. And the White House's response was, "I am not making this up. It was a legitimate misunderstanding. We thought Lebanon was not part of the deal. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a pattern. Every time diplomacy gets close, something happens to break it." Because there are actors in this conflict for whom a successful negotiated peace would mean their historical agenda goes unfulfilled. And a historical agenda once internalized as identity cannot be traded away at a negotiating table. Does that make sense? Does everyone follow this? Okay. Now, I have to talk about something that makes everyone nervous, and that is the nuclear dimension of this conflict. Because here is where we are. The New START treaty between the United States and Russia expired in February 2026. The last legal framework limiting American and Russian nuclear weapons is gone. There are no more constraints. Meanwhile, China has approximately 620 nuclear warheads right now and is expected to reach 1,000 by 2030 and 2,500 by 2035. And the doomsday clock, the symbolic measure maintained by scientists of how close we are to nuclear catastrophe, is closer to midnight than at any point since 1947. Here is what worries me the most. It is not that any leader wakes up in the morning and decides to use a nuclear weapon. It is much more subtle than that. It is something called dual-capable weapons. China has missile brigades equipped with the DF-26, a missile that can carry either a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead. The crews are trained to swap between them on short notice. This means that if an American commander sees a DF-26 launched at a U.S. carrier group, he has approximately 6 to 8 minutes to decide whether it is a conventional strike or a nuclear strike. And he must decide before it hits, because if it is nuclear and he waits, he loses everything. So we are building a world where a mistake, a misread, a computer glitch, and an early warning system like the Chinese Huan-1 satellite network that is now designed to detect American ICBMs within 90 seconds of launch could trigger a war that no one chose. A war that starts not because a leader decided to start it, but because an algorithm said launch detected and the clock said 9 minutes. This is what happens when ideology intersects with technology. This is what happens when the historical narrative a society has built around conflict starts to sync up with the weapons it has built to fight. Okay, I know this is a lot. Let me pull it all together. We started with Senator Blumenthal walking out of a briefing room angry. I told you this was a symptom. Now I have shown you the disease. The disease is this. America entered this war with a military strategy that made sense on a spreadsheet. Destroy air defenses, destroy command and control, regime falls, or negotiate. But the strategy failed because it was built on 3 assumptions that were all wrong. First assumption that Iran's military could be dismantled from the top down. Wrong. The Mosaic defense has no single head to target. 31 cells, all fighting independently, none of them capable of being stopped by neutralizing the leadership. Second assumption, that economic pain would break Iranian will. Wrong. Because Iran is not fighting for economic comfort. Iran is fighting an ideological war. A war about identity, about sovereignty, about who gets to decide the future of the region. And ideological wars are not ended by sanctions. They are ended when one side's narrative completely collapses, or when one side is completely exhausted. There is no middle option. Third assumption, that this could be contained to the Middle East. Wrong. Because the Strait of Hormuz handles 20% of the world's energy supply. Because China is watching, stockpiling, providing satellites and waiting. Because Taiwan is watching and getting nervous. Because Germany is watching and cutting its growth forecast. Because circuit boards cost 40% more. Because farmers in America cannot afford fertilizer and are reducing their crop sizes. Because the world is connected and a war in the Persian Gulf is not a local event. And here is the final thing I will leave you with. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Arashi has been moving fast this week. He flew to Pakistan twice. He went to Muscatan, Oman, and then he flew to St. Petersburg to meet Putin directly. That is the physical travel. And on top of that, he has been on the phone with the foreign ministers of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and France. This is what a diplomatic sprint looks like when you are trying to show the world you are not isolated. He is building a coalition. He is trying to show that the supreme leader is alive and the government is functional. And his message everywhere is the same. End the war first, give us guarantees, build trust. Then and only then we can talk about the nuclear program and everything else. And Trump looked at Iran's proposal and said they offered a lot, but not enough. You know what that means? That means America knows it cannot win. And Iran knows America cannot win. And both sides are now negotiating not over victory, but over how to save face. Iran is not asking to win. Iran is just asking to not lose. And in this kind of war, a war of ideology, a war of mosaic defense, a war of attrition math, not losing is winning. So I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about this seriously, not just respond quickly. You have 50 years of relative stability built on American military dominance. You have an entire global economic system, trade, finance, supply chains, internet infrastructure, built on the assumption that the US can project force anywhere in the world and nobody can stop it. What happens to that system when the world figures out, when every government on every continent figures out that that assumption is no longer true? What happens when China looks at this and says, okay, now is the time? What happens when Taiwan looks at its LG reserves and realizes they have maybe 2 weeks before the lights go out if China blockades the island? What happens when the countries that have been under American hegemony for 70 years, the countries that built their security strategy around American protection, start shopping for alternatives? I am not telling you the world is ending. I'm telling you that the rules,